From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Dan O'Brien will look at the current price ratios between corn and soybeans and sorghum and corn at various delivery points around Kansas and how that information can be useful to you producers in your marketing and production plans. Also today, we've the first of a two-part visit with K-State's Cassie Jones and Jordan Gebhardt on Livestock Feed Biosecurity. They've been conducting extensive research trials on curbing the spread of African swine fever with the aim of developing biosecurity protocols in feed processing and delivery that would benefit all of animal agriculture. And later, K-State's Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather. It's all here on this Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
First off, on this Agriculture Today, it's to our weekly grain market segment and the latest insight on the trends from K-State Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, what you say you want to offer up initially today is a series of price ratios for our major grains produced in Kansas. What do you have here, and what are you hoping it'll tell us?
Well, we want to look at the relative prices of milo to corn in different key locations, and also soybean to corn. You know, those ratios, they're likely to impact people's expectations of the markets and profits as we head off into 2021 and all the planting seasons that are right before us. Of course, the best thing to look at would be the new crop bids, the new crop forward contract bids that are out there. But I think it's just a truism that what we think is going to happen out next fall is influenced somewhat by what we have right in front of us. So when you look at soybean to corn ratios across the state, they're ranging from about 2.4 up to about 2.75, and the strongest relative soybean price to corn, well, it's basically in Salina and Topeka, with Hutchinson not far behind, about 2.65 to 2.75, 2.77. So anytime you're above 2.4, 2.5, it's advantage soybeans. Well, out in the western part of the state, Colby, Garden City on yesterday's cash prices, about 2.49, 2.38, and you've got, again, 1083 as a listed price in both Colby and Garden City, and cash prices for corn, extremely healthy, 435 to 456. So tremendous prices. What happens when you head to the east is that you weaken that corn price, generally ranging from about 409, 417 down southeast Kansas, Columbus, very corner, tying into that some poultry usage down there, about 430. So overall, the places that have the strongest soybean to corn price ratios they're around those stronger export areas of the state. Again, Salina, Hutchinson, Topeka is as it is in terms of where the strength's at. Now, for sorghum to corn, which could be an issue all across the state, probably more so in the western two-thirds and maybe southeast, just because of our experience in growing sorghum out in those areas, currently or in the past, more so. You're looking at sorghum prices, well, in everywhere but southeast Kansas, running from about 537 up to 571, and corn prices in those same areas about 409 to 456. So in most of these areas, you got a ratio of 1.2 to 1.39, 1.4 of sorghum to corn. And sorghum has a very strong demand base with one country. And so it's a very, very good market to take advantage of. Personally, I think I would look to manage that risk of the U.S. relationships with China with some pretty proactive forward pricing. I wouldn't just sit on this and trust the cash market to be there given what in the world could happen in 2021 between China and the United States.
Well, these ratios give an interesting portrayal of the relationships between these prices, and these could weigh into producers' decisions going forward come planting time in the spring, among other things. But let's stay with the marketing side of it, Dan, and how a producer could protect, given the prices that we have currently, against the downside. You've put some thoughts together in this week's notes on setting a floor for these prices and making the most of what we have going right now.
I want to build into that by looking at what's happened about the last couple of weeks in the future for each of these commodities, and then stand back and look at, either forward contract bids or some option bids for either old crop or new crop to see where we might go. Mm-hmm. First of all, you look at corn futures. We're looking at March now, March corn futures. And by the way, when you look at where the volume and open interest is at in the markets, well, about 900,000 contracts of open interest in the March contract, still quite a bit in May, and then some out there in December, but the lion's share out there in March. So if we wonder where the markets are going to go, they're going to go up front. They're following that lead contract, and then there's people, probably commercials out there hedging beyond that, but probably the speculative traders, the managed money people, they're up front, and the rest of the futures complex tends to follow. Anyway, so with that, their March is at 426.5. It had been here of late up to about 430, down briefly to 410. And when I say briefly, that's about where we've been since mid-November. So when you look out, if you have old crop grain and are wondering what to do with it, there are some coming into December, tax management, things like that. They're probably wondering about, well, with great basis bids on top of all that in these areas, probably wondering about selling the cash, taking advantage of the great basis that's there, and then looking at some type of an option purchase. And so let's go out to May, into the planting season when we have some volatility. We're at about 428.75, about basically at the money is about 430. And if you're going to buy a call option, which is what people probably look at, a call option to put them in position in case things would go higher, at the money is about 24 cents. So a lot of folks will say, gosh, I could have stored that in an elevator. That's 5 or 6 cents a bushel, and they cost you about the same there. So they may not spend all that right at the money. It depends what they want to protect against. If they want to gain every penny above 430, well, then they'd buy at the money. If they're worried about not missing out on a big rally, and say they were only willing to spend, say, 15 cents, well, then they're looking at something about 460. Spend the 15 cents, you'd have to get above 475. You have to cover that's intrinsic value without accounting for some of the variability that could come in. So anyway, that's there. And then there's the new crop situation for choices. 410.75 was the close yesterday in the futures at the money for a put option to protect the downside, 32 cents basically. So what's that put you at? 32 cents off of 410, you're at 478. That you'd have to drop a 378. That makes a big difference. 378, and which isn't the worst of all things. So that's something to consider. And frankly, the more people are considering pricing up front, and the more they may look at, say, a $4 put option at 26 cents or a $3.90 at 20 cents to lessen up their expenditure. Just to keep in mind that, yes, we've got optimism right now, but a lot of things can happen in this whole world in the grain markets to make things move lower. So it's something to think about. And of course, if you just forward contract, then you have locked in price, et cetera. But before people have planted any crop, given experiences in the Corn Belt with delayed plantings and who knows what can come in, probably up front here, they're considering something in the options, and probably out of the money options to protect the downside. If you told yourself, I'm only going to spend 15 cents again, you're buying a 370, 380 put, and basically protecting about 355, 360. And right now, gosh, that seems to be way down there. Give us a few months and one or two other nefarious things happening in the world geopolitical situation, and that could look pretty good.
Well, walk us similarly through soybeans and the exercise that producers might want to go through to figure out their best alternative currently.
Well, again, we've been closed yesterday at 11.6825, and a lot of that has to do with dryness in Brazil, whether rains are going to come that are forecast or not, et cetera. We have traded up to basically $12 within the last couple of weeks, as low as $11.50. So we're in an area that's awfully high relative to where we've been any time in the last several years. And that's the January contract. When you look at, again, where the volume is at, where people have their numbers at, well, 262,000 contracts in the March contract, May 126, July 112, November has like 95, 96. So still front loaded. You go out and you look at the options, just to get right to the point. If you sell now, sell any soybeans that you have and are not wanting to miss out on what could be a sizable rally, and there could be a sizable rally given the problems they've had in South America that are unresolved. Look at May, a May option, buy a call at 11.80, 55 cents. The market knows you're coming. The market knows you're coming, and they're going to make you pay for it. And it's a higher priced asset. So if you're willing to spend only about 30 cents, then you get up to about 12.80. So what we just talked about for corn seems to be a lot more in people's price range than what we're talking about for soybeans. When you look at out there in November for price floors, interesting that 10.40, that's at the money. And right now the market would charge you 65 cents. Interesting. It wasn't that long. We were looking at 9.40, 9.50 and wondering if we were ever going to get to 10. Well, you go down to $10 now, it's 42 cents. You go down to 9.60, 23, 24 cents. So if you're looking for downside price protection to protect yourself against what could happen out in the fall of 2021, you can go to what we used to think was a good price, about $1 lower than now, pay about a quarter, and perhaps be able to sleep better at night than not having that type of protection.
You might want to look at Dan's notes on the grain markets this week to get a greater feel of what he's getting at here with these suggestions. You can find those at agmanager.info. As always, Dan, thanks, and next Friday we'll do it again.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien is a grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. And you're listening to Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Next up for you on Agriculture Today, a theme that was talked up extensively at the virtual K-State Swine Day 2020, something that is of wide interest not only to the swine production sector, but to the livestock industries in the bigger context, and that is livestock feed biosecurity. We have brought by the two presenters on that topic at Swine Day. Cassie Jones with us once again, a feed scientist out of the Animal Sciences and Industry Department at K-State. And over from the College of Veterinary Medicine, a researcher in the Diagnostic Medicine and Pathobiology Division of the college, Jordan Gebhardt. What we want to do here is go over what you two have been working on in the laboratories and in real-life scenarios as far as feed biosecurity, some of the things you've discovered to date. We'll start, though, with you, Cassie, to give us a bit of background because you've been on point on a number of these things for quite some time now. What's the general gist of this body of research?
Sure, and thanks for having us today. When we think about feed biosecurity, it's something that we inherently have been worried about for even centuries, ever since we domesticated animals to make sure that the feed is safe for them. Historically, that's really focused on nutritional safety and adequacy, but what we've realized over recent decades, and especially recent years, is that feed can also be a source of pathogen introduction, like bad viruses, bad bacterium, into production settings. And we have so many different hurdles to prevent those viruses or bacteria from entering and other ways, like we might shower in and out, or we may keep animals in quarantine or in isolation for a period of time. But we don't typically have those same expectations for feed. And so a lot of our research focuses around how can we ensure safety of feed and ensure that it's safe for consumption by animals and not a potential source of pathogen transmission.
Cassie, you have taken express interest in recent years in this devastating porcine disease in other parts of the world, thankfully, not here in the U.S. as of yet, African swine fever, and how it is transmitted. Give us a quick synopsis of that work, so far anyway.
Yeah, African swine fever virus is really the most devastating disease that we've seen of late. We are fortunate, like you said, that it is not in North America, and that really has been a credit to our producers, but also is very important to continue to keep it out because it can be so devastating. We see the impact that it's had in Southeast Asia and in Eastern Europe and have lost millions of pigs over the last 2 years to this devastating disease, and it's really difficult to eradicate. And so it's become a top priority for animal agriculture collectively to keep this one out. Our research focuses on preventing it from getting into the U.S. through a feed or an ingredient, because we do import a fair number of ingredients from some countries that have endemic circulating virus. And our goal is to identify what are the risks and characteristics of different ingredients and prevent that risk as much as possible.
In a highly biosecure environment, you've been able to look at how this virus behaves in swine feed processing, right?
Exactly. This is certainly not something that we take lightly. We have 2 locations in the United States that we can actually work with African swine fever virus at this capacity. One is here at K-State in our Biosecurity Research Institute, and the other is Plum Island off the coast of New York. And so having the ability to work with this is something we take very seriously and take a lot of precautions to make sure that we're doing it safely. However, it is important for us to be able to do this work. In order to really understand how to prevent transmission, we have to understand the characteristics of that transmission. Jordan will share some of his stories from Vietnam of what we see naturally occurring in the field, but it's also important to look at that in a controlled research setting. We manufacture different batches of feed, and we intentionally added African swine fever virus to one of those batches. And then we looked at where did the virus go throughout the manufacturing facility and how many batches of feed did it potentially impact. And that has really significant implications because if this were to enter into the United States, it will help us in our tracking capabilities and understanding, okay, this group of pigs has the virus. Now, what other animals or what other epidemiological links or cases are there and how could they be related to this? And so understanding that potential transmission through feed is key. Even today, we will manufacture feed, deliver it to a farm, take that same feed truck back to the feed mill and deliver it to another farm. And so we're concerned that both the feed truck as well as the feed itself may be a source of farm-to-farm transmission if this ever were to get into the United States.
And that is Jordan's work. But before we get to that, what have you found within the processing facility itself that is of usefulness here in determining protocols for the future?
Well, unfortunately, it's not good news. We thought perhaps that African swine fever virus, because it's a really large virus compared to other viruses that we've worked with, we thought perhaps it would not persist or be as widely distributed throughout the manufacturing facility. But we learned the opposite is true, that as soon as this virus is introduced into a feed mill, it persists and it goes everywhere. And really one of the biggest concerns for transmission is the people themselves. When we were in the Biosecurity Research Institute manufacturing the feed, we got it on the bottom of our shoes incidentally. And of course, still all in biocontainment, but we were able to track that through various batches of feed and really see how that could contaminate subsequent batches and be a risk to other farms in the future.
So there are hurdles to be cleared here. Let's bring Jordan back in. Talk about this work with a collaborator in Vietnam where African swine fever has truly riddled its swine industry. You were looking at, as Cassie mentioned, this aspect of transport of the virus through feed delivery from operation to operation, correct?
Absolutely, and that was a big area of the investigation that we were fortunate enough to be involved with our collaborator in Vietnam. And as you mentioned, Vietnam and many areas of Southeast Asia have really been devastated with ASF in the past few years. So what they wanted to do and what they were interested in is going back to a lot of the work that Dr. Jones and the team here at Kansas State and others across the U.S. have done, trying to understand the risk of feed and the link that feed movement and the movement of people, feed trucks, and the feed products themselves. What can we do and what can they do in country, in Vietnam, to help reduce the spread of ASF, given it's known to be circulating in the area? And what they wanted to do is identify their current biosecurity practices, and they had some very robust biosecurity practices, even compared to what we do here in the U.S., as far as employee movement and movement of trucks and other products which could be causing contamination, spread of that contamination. And they wanted to evaluate, were those biosecurity measures working? Were there any shortfalls or any areas where improvements could be made? And how could they implement those changes? So what we initially found right off the bat is we sampled a lot of the feed delivery trucks. We know that that's one of the main links from farm to farm. And as Cassie mentioned, that if a farm is infected, is it likely that that truck delivering feed to the farm is contaminated? Can it bring it back to the mill? And then can it carry it to other facilities? And so some of the early really key takeaway findings from some of that research was we certainly could find it on the feed trucks themselves, both the outside of the feed truck, but also surprising to us was the inside of the feed trucks. The employees were supposed to be staying in the trucks when they go to farm to deliver the feed, but we clearly demonstrated with some of this contamination that at some point those drivers were bringing contamination into the cabs of these feed delivery trucks. And what the system had implemented was controlling and disinfecting the outside, the tires, the exterior surfaces of these trucks, but they really weren't decontaminating and considering the inside of the cabs. So what they did was rather novel in their approach, and they took a backpack leaf blower and they mounted a tank of disinfectant on it, and they would essentially fumigate the inside of these cabs in response to the information that we generated saying that the cabs of these trucks are a source of contamination. And since they did this and since they implemented this early on, we've really seen a reduction in the amount of contamination inside those truck cabs. And in general, across the mill in general, we've seen fairly low levels of contamination, which to us, given what Cassie had just mentioned, that in a known setting where we take a certain level of contamination, introduce it into a feed mill, we know in a controlled setting that virus goes everywhere, based on some of the work here at the BRI at Kansas State. But what we found in Vietnam is that we can detect some contamination within the feed mill on a variety of surfaces, but in general that level of contamination is fairly low. So in general, what we've learned in Vietnam is people movement and truck movement is really important areas of contamination we need to consider. A series of systematic investigations like this where we use a science-based approach to collect information, analyze that information, and then determine what the next best steps are for that farmer, for that producer, to be able to implement change within a production system to help maintain healthy animal herds within this setting and avoid ASF contamination to some of their naive farms.
Well, through these projects, the both of you have already built up quite a body of knowledge about viruses and about how they can travel through the feed processing, feed distribution mechanisms that we have in the industry. What we'd like to do is take some time and look at this in a wide context, the importance of all of this to the livestock sectors entirely, and some of the protocols that may be coming forth. We'd like to have you back on Monday to do that, if we might. So thanks for now. We'll talk again then.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much.
Once again, they presented information on these subjects of feed biosecurity at the K-State 2020 Virtual Swine Day out of the university several days ago. Jordan Gebhardt from the College of Veterinary Medicine and Cassie Jones from the Animal Sciences and Industry Department here at Kansas State University. We'll return with more on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network, now in its 97th year of broadcast service to agriculture in Kansas and the Central Plains. Eric Atkinson with you now. Today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Arkansas Senator John Boozman says he's looking forward to the opportunity to take the lead for Republicans on the Senate Agriculture Committee in the next Congress. With Senate Ag Committee Chairman Pat Roberts of Kansas retiring from Congress, Boozman is in line to become either the chairman or the ranking member of the Senate Agricultural Committee. That depends on the outcome of that Georgia Senate runoff, those two elections in January. Looking at agriculture and farm income, Boozman noted yesterday that farmers appreciate the aid they've received over the past couple of years, especially here in 2020, with government payments looking to account for just under 40% overall of net farm income. But Boozman said such high payments cannot last. As a result, he said senators are focused on ensuring that China meets its Phase 1 agreement obligations to buy more agricultural products. Lawmakers expect China will uphold its end of that agreement even after President Trump leaves office in January. And Boozman put a lot of emphasis on continued trade talks with the United Kingdom and the European Union that would have to come through negotiations with the incoming Biden administration. More trade agreements are needed, says Boozman, because U.S. producers are driven to increase production. Without specifically mentioning climate change, Boozman acknowledged that Congress and the Biden administration will be paying more attention to cleaner air, cleaner water, and protecting soil in the process. He said that's going to demand more research to ensure that farmers can benefit financially as more emphasis is put on conservation measures. Boozman also emphasized more investment in agricultural research to give producers tools to lower their input costs. The USDA's Risk Management Agency has finalized a crop insurance change for spring planted crops that will require farms nationally to meet the so-called 1 in 4 planting requirement for acres to be eligible for prevented planting coverage. That change was among multiple policy tweaks that will go into effect for 2021 spring crops. Here's the USDA's Rod Bain with more.
The USDA Risk Management Agency-led task force convened last spring to discuss and recommend improvements to prevented planting crop insurance coverage. And RMA's administrator, Martin Barbary, says the results are improvements that recently took effect and are available for the 2021 crop year.
We're seeing some places in the country where prevent plant was becoming sort of a norm and felt like the thing to do was just make the 1 in 4 nationwide, so that's what we've done.
Referring to a provision in the Prairie Potholes region requiring producers to plant, insure, and harvest acreage in at least one of the 4 most recent crop years for eligibility. Additional modifications create greater flexibilities regarding second crop plantings after a first crop prevented planting on the same acreage. For instance, a previous rule changed the type of prevented plant field once a second planting occurred.
It would encourage producers to go ahead and try to plant a second crop if they didn't get that first crop planted without being penalized for the extra acreages in that field that they don't get planted. Just another flexibility.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Now, that 1 in 4 rule began in the Prairie Pothole region back in the 2012 crop year. Under the provision, crop acreage must have been planted and harvested at least once in the last 4 years to be eligible for prevented planting coverage. For spring crops, the rule going into effect nationally for the 2021 crop year, the acreage must have been planted and harvested at least once from 2017 through the 2020 crop years. If acreage fails to meet that 1 in 4 rule, the ground must be planted, insured, and harvested, or have an adjusted claim for loss after planting for 2 consecutive years before becoming eligible again for prevented planting coverage. The results are in now on the 2020 National Wheat Yield Contest, and as one might expect, Kansas was very well represented. Marcia Boswell has more on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
Kansas wheat farmers demonstrated their agronomic prowess in the 2020 National Wheat Yield Contest. State winners from this year's contest were recently released by the National Wheat Foundation, which organizes the competition. According to Justin Gilpin, Kansas Wheat CEO, our farmers continue to show why Kansas is America's breadbasket through the National Wheat Yield Contest. The 5th year of this national competition saw new growers enter the contest, and some of our best producers being recognized for supreme management of their wheat acres. These results demonstrate to Kansas wheat farmers how they can maximize yield potential while maintaining excellent quality. 77 wheat growers from 25 states participated in the contest, which allowed Kansas wheat farmers to compete against their counterparts in other states and learn more about potential ways to further boost production through new and innovative techniques. The contest was split into winter wheat and spring wheat and then further divided into dryland and irrigated production. In the dryland winter wheat category, Tyler Ediger from Meade came out on top with a final yield of 108.43 bushels per acre. The variety for this winning entry was Westbred's WB 4792. This plot also earned Ediger a 5th place finish in the national contest in the dryland category, based on a 205.01% increase over the county average. Winners in this portion of the contest were determined by yield increases exceeding the most recent 5-year Olympic county average, as determined by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Andrew Lee from Cowley placed 2nd in this category, yielding 105.09 bushels per acre, with Westbred's WB 4401. Darwin Ediger, also from Meade, placed 3rd with a Westbred Winterhawk entry that yielded 104.43 bushels per acre. In the irrigated winter wheat category, Kim Gamble from Kiowa took the top slot. His entry of Westbred 4792 yielded 135.39 bushels per acre. Eric Purvis from Wallace placed 2nd with a Westbred WB Grainfield plot that yielded 124.77 bushels per acre. Brock Neville from Sedgwick earned 3rd place at 106.14 bushels per acre with a Westbred WB 4699 entry. Gilpin said congratulations to all of our state winners in this year's National Wheat Yield Contest. We are excited to watch how Kansas wheat continues to excel and increase in profitability by maximizing yields. Official rules and entry details for the 2021 contest will be available by January 1st at yieldcontest.wheatfoundation.org. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and we'll return after this final break. You're tuned to Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Capping off this Agriculture Today, we've brought aboard K-State Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp for the weekly glance at the Kansas agricultural weather scene, and Mary, now that we're in December, with the November recap, which should come as hardly a surprise to anybody.
Right. The statewide average was slightly drier than normal, about 88% of normal, but it was a very distinct have and have-not pattern. The have-nots were northwest and west central Kansas, where they averaged less than half of what they normally would see in November. And November is not a particularly prolific month for those areas of the state. You get into southwest Kansas, and they fared a little bit better. They were above normal, but the surplus was, on average, less than 0.02 of an inch. So, needless to say, it didn't make very big inroads on the drought that they are facing out there. In the Northeast, they were the wettest, and they saw well above what we would normally see for November. But most of that came in the last few days of the month.
It was backloaded.
Yeah, it was very much backloaded. And we've returned to a dry pattern. So, again, it was that split profile of a band of very heavy moisture from the eastern part of southwestern Kansas up through central and northeastern Kansas that divided the state. Temperature-wise, we were above normal. That did not mean that we didn't have the extremes. We ended the month with our coldest temperature, 3 degrees in Oakley, Kansas. That was not as cold as our lowest in November. Our lowest November reading was a -2. So it was cold, but it was by no means any kind of record cold. And again, for the month, it was warmer than normal, but it fell pretty much in the middle of our distribution for that, so not super warm. Big thing was the roller coaster of temperatures, getting very warm, getting cold, and then getting warm again. And so that's a typical pattern that we see during a La Nina winter.
And to just get up to speed on the drought monitor then, as of this past Tuesday, the dryness that you described for the month of November is fairly well reflected there, isn't it?
It certainly is. Parts of south central and southeastern Kansas are now drought-free, thanks to that moisture that we had before Thanksgiving in those areas. There was further deterioration in the southwest. Again, 0.02 of an inch doesn't go very far for a surplus, particularly when we had those warmer temperatures that meant we've got higher evaporative demand than would be typical. So we saw some deterioration in that area. The rest of the state was pretty much unchanged, but we do still have moderate to severe drought across the north central, northeastern part, and some extreme drought in northwestern Kansas.
Now, that's not to speak of the heavier snowfall that occurred in mid-part of this week in, well, we'll call it the meshing point between south central and southwest Kansas.
Right, and that's one thing that's been pretty noteworthy, not only with this most recent storm, but with some of our earlier storms where the heaviest moisture has been along our southern border. This storm took a southerly track with most of it going through the Texas Panhandle into Oklahoma. So the Clark County over to Ford County area saw the heaviest snowfalls. There was a report of 14 inches in Clark County and additional reports of over 10 inches in that area. It drops off into the 5-6 inches as you go a little bit further east. Go north, and amounts drop off very quickly. And, of course, up in the north-central, northeastern part of the state, we didn't see anything at all. So, again, a southerly track to the storm with the bulk of that moisture in the form of snow rather than ice. There's some rain on the leading edge of it, but, again, it was very much of a winter storm pattern. Unfortunately, most of that moisture fell in areas that are already drought-free, so we're unlikely to see very significant improvement on the drought conditions there. We'll note, if people want more details on that, there will be a drought update that will be in today's Agronomy E-Update. And next Monday at 1 o'clock, the Kansas Water Office is hosting a drought update as well as a climate outlook for the winter, December, January, February, and into spring. And I will be participating on that program. There is a link to the Kansas Water Office webinar. People can check that out and get some more details on that drought situation.
So have a look later today at the latest e-update out of K-State Agronomy, agronomy.ksu.edu, or go directly to the Kansas Water Office website for further information on taking in that webinar. And by the sound of it, that snow that occurred these past few days will be our last such run for a while as we look at the outlook.
The outlook is very interesting. The 6 to 10 day outlook is favoring warmer and drier than normal conditions. But as we move out a little bit further and get closer to that Christmas holiday, there is some signal for colder than normal conditions, particularly in the western high plains, and also a hint of above normal moisture in that same region. So we'll be watching that very carefully because it will certainly be welcome to get at least some precipitation in that region, but it's too early to tell how much might be squeezed out of it. For the next week, the quantitative precip forecast is basically zero. There is a slight amount that may show up in southeastern Kansas as that storm from yesterday exits the state, but not a particularly large amount is expected, less than 1/4 of an inch.
And temperatures, again, relatively mild for the season ahead.
Right. We are expecting milder temperatures, but not necessarily warm temperatures. We're looking at highs maybe in the 50s, so that would be above normal for this time of the year, but certainly not record-setting.
We're in December, after all. Mary, we appreciate it. We'll talk again next Friday. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. Likewise, thanks to you for being along with us, and enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.